Earlier, when you were describing how you got started with ComponentSense, you mentioned walking through, a client facility, and they had all this stock that was, stacked up in the warehouse and everything. So I have to ask, if you weren't performing this service for companies, taking this excess genuine stock off their hands and, redistributing it, what would happen to all those components?
Yeah, I mean, they tend to just sit, in a corner, and that's how I knew it was discarded stock, is because it was not nice and neat on the shelves. The production stock is typically very well cared for. This stuff was just piled up in a corner, so it was really obvious it was somehow different. But it was predominantly foil packs. If I see a foil pack vacuum sealed of a brick or 12-inch reel or 13-inch reel, there's serious value in that. They don't go to that trouble for stuff that's not worth money. And if you see piles of that in a factory in that sort of discarded state, then that's a lot of money. And we typically find it's about 10% of revenue accumulates in excess or obsolete components. So it's about 1% of revenue is dead to them. They'll never use it ever again. So it's been designed out effectively. And then there's this 10%, 9% that makes up the 10% that's just slow moving. But a lot of that will be very slow moving. We now describe it kind of like an iceberg. You've got this little bit of obsolete on the top, the 1%, and then you've got the slow moving, the very slow moving. And it's all going to be dead at some point. Technology moves so quickly now. If we can get people to think that, wow, I might have 10% of my revenue tied up in slow moving or excess stock, and move it quickly. If they can engage with somebody like us quickly, they could probably get all the money back. If they're $1 billion plus company, their buying power is such that we can usually give them all their money back and sell it downstream to somebody that would normally be paying double. A $1 billion company pays half the price of, say, a 100 million turnover company. So we can easily sell it downstream. The smaller company wins because they're buying it for less. And also in the knowledge that they're helping the redistribution of stuff that might ultimately end up in waste. It doesn't tend to go straight to waste. Nobody says, oh, that's excess, let's bin it. They sit on it and they hope that, oh, well, maybe a forecast will come back. And there's a phrase that I hear a lot in the EMS world, is that buyers would rather be looking at stock than looking for it. So they don't want, they tend to hoard it rather than move it on. But the longer you hang on to it, the more likely it's going to end up, in landfill or getting crushed. And crushing's, it's an option at the end of the day. We don't want to go down that route. It's very energy intensive, and it recovers a tiny fraction of a percent of the value of the device. And our feeling is that there's so much resources gone into making these devices. Then please, for goodness sake, let's make sure they get a life. Give them a 10-year life in a device at minimum.